Case 1. Leilani Simon. The murder of Quentin Simon, Chatham County, Georgia, 2022. On October 5, 2022, in the coastal city of Chatham County, Georgia, 911 dispatchers received a call that would launch one of the most extensive search operations in the region's recent history. Leilani Simon, a 22-year-old mother, reported that her 20-month-old son, Quentin Simon, was missing from their family home in Savannah. The initial response was swift and massive. Local law enforcement, FBI agents, and hundreds of volunteers flooded the area. Helicopters circled overhead while search dogs combed through neighborhoods, parks, and wooded areas. The Chatham County Police Department coordinated with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, treating the case with the urgency that any missing toddler case demands. Leilani's story seemed straightforward at first. She told investigators that she had put Quentin to bed the previous night and discovered him missing the following morning. The window of his bedroom had been left open, she claimed, suggesting a possible abduction. In those early hours, the community rallied around what they believed was a grieving, terrified mother. Vigils were held. Social media campaigns spread Quentin's photo across the state and beyond. But investigators trained for years to read between the lines, to spot inconsistencies, to follow evidence rather than emotion. And almost immediately, things about Leilani's account didn't add up. Within 48 hours of the initial report, the Chatham County Police Department made an unusual announcement. They were no longer treating this as a simple missing person case. They believed Quentin Simon was deceased, and they believed his mother, Leilani Simon, was responsible. The evidence that led to this conclusion began accumulating almost from the moment investigators arrived at the Simon home. The forensic timeline didn't match Leilani's statements. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect the scent of human remains, alerted repeatedly inside the residence. Cell phone data placed Leilani in locations she hadn't mentioned. Witnesses came forward with information that contradicted her narrative. Perhaps most damning were the statements from family members who lived in the same home. Billie Jo Howell, Quentin's maternal grandmother, cooperated fully with investigators. She provided information that painted a disturbing picture of Quentin's final days. The household, investigators learned, was chaotic. There were substance use issues. There were conflicts about childcare responsibilities. And there were concerns about how the children were being treated. Leilani Simon had 3 children at the time of Quentin's disappearance. The 2 surviving children were immediately removed from the home and placed in protective custody. Their statements, given through trained child forensic interviewers, would later prove crucial to the investigation. As days turned into weeks, the search for Quentin's body continued. The FBI brought in specialized equipment. Dive teams searched waterways. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed in areas around the family home. The entire community remained on edge, desperate for answers, hoping against hope that somehow Quentin might still be found alive. But investigators knew better. The evidence was pointing to a conclusion too horrible for most people to accept. On October 12, 2022, exactly 1 week after Quentin was reported missing, the Chatham County Police Department made a grim announcement. Based on their investigation, they believed Quentin's body had been disposed of in a dumpster and transported to a landfill. They were beginning a search operation at the Waste Management Landfill in Chatham County. Landfill searches are among the most challenging operations in law enforcement. The Chatham County landfill receives thousands of tons of refuse every single day. The area that needed to be searched encompassed acres of compacted garbage, some buried under layers 20 feet deep. The smell alone was overwhelming. The physical labor was grueling, and the emotional toll on the search teams was immense. Special equipment was brought in. Excavators moved massive amounts of debris. Teams of investigators, wearing protective gear, carefully sifted through garbage by hand. Every piece of material had to be examined. Every small item could potentially be evidence. The search was methodical, painstaking, and heartbreaking. The FBI assigned additional resources. Anthropologists from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation joined the effort, bringing expertise in identifying human remains even in advanced states of decomposition. The search continued through October, into November, into December. The weather turned cold. Rain turned the landfill into a muddy nightmare. But the teams didn't stop. Members of the community watched the news coverage with a mixture of hope and dread. How could a mother do this? What could drive someone to such an unthinkable act? These questions echoed through Savannah and beyond. On November 18, 2022, more than 6 weeks after the search began, investigators made a devastating announcement. They had found human remains consistent with those of a toddler. The remains were transported to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab for analysis and positive identification. The forensic identification process took several weeks. The remains were fragmentary and decomposed, making the process complex and time-consuming. But on December 21, 2022, the medical examiner confirmed what everyone feared. The remains were positively identified as those of Quinton Simon. The cause of death could not be definitively determined due to the condition of the remains, but the circumstances spoke volumes. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. On November 21, 2022, before the remains were even positively identified, Leilani Simon had been arrested and charged with multiple offenses including malice murder, felony murder, concealing the death of another, and false reporting. She was held without bond at the Chatham County Detention Center. The arrest warrant and subsequent court filings laid out the prosecution's theory of the case. They alleged that Leilani Simon had killed her son sometime during the early morning hours of October 5, 2022. They alleged she had concealed his body and disposed of it in a dumpster, knowing it would be transported to the landfill. They alleged she had then waited several hours before reporting him missing, creating a false narrative of abduction to cover her tracks. The evidence included forensic findings from the home, cell phone data, witness statements, and behavioral analysis. Prosecutors built a circumstantial case, as they often must in cases where a body is not recovered immediately or where the cause of death cannot be definitively established. The trial began in October 2024, exactly 2 years after Quinton's death. The Chatham County Courthouse was packed every single day. Court TV provided gavel-to-gavel coverage, broadcasting the proceedings nationwide. The case had captured public attention not just in Georgia, but across the country. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough. They called dozens of witnesses over several weeks of testimony. FBI agents described the search operations. Forensic experts explained the scientific evidence. Family members testified about the household conditions and Leilani's behavior. The jury heard recordings of 911 calls and watched interviews with investigators. One of the most powerful moments came when prosecutors presented evidence of Leilani's activities in the hours before she reported Quinton missing. Cell phone records showed she had been active on social media, making posts and browsing content, apparently unconcerned that her toddler was supposedly missing. Surveillance footage from various locations contradicted multiple aspects of her statement to police. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They pointed out that the medical examiner could not determine a cause of death. They suggested that Quinton might have died accidentally and that Leilani, panicking and possibly under the influence of substances, made terrible decisions in the aftermath, but was not a murderer. They argued that the prosecution was asking the jury to make assumptions based on incomplete evidence. But the prosecution's rebuttal was powerful. They argued that the totality of the evidence painted an unmistakable picture. The deliberate disposal of the body, the false report, the lack of emotion or concern appropriate for a mother whose child had vanished, the forensic evidence from the home, the statements from witnesses about her behavior and statements in the days before Quinton disappeared. On October 23, 2024, after several days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. They found Leilani Simon guilty on all counts, including malice murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Quinton's grandmother, Billie Jo Howell, who had cooperated fully with investigators despite the fact that it implicated her own daughter, wept openly. The sentencing phase followed. In Georgia, a malice murder conviction carries either life in prison with the possibility of parole, life without the possibility of parole, or the death penalty. Prosecutors did not seek the death penalty in this case. On October 24, 2024, the judge sentenced Leilani Simon to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for the other charges. Leilani Simon showed little emotion during the sentencing. She made no statement to the court, no apology, no explanation. She was led away in handcuffs to begin serving her sentence at a Georgia State Correctional Facility. The case of Quinton Simon represents one of the most disturbing examples of maternal homicide in recent Georgia history. The deliberate disposal of the body, the elaborate deception, and the lack of remorse distinguish this case even among other tragic cases of parents harming their children. For the Savannah community and for the hundreds of volunteers who searched for Quinton, the case left scars that may never fully heal. If you're finding this investigation compelling, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment. Your engagement helps us continue producing in-depth documentaries like this one. Case 2. Tiffany Moss. The starvation death of Imani Moss, Gwinnett County, Georgia, 2013. On November 2, 2013, in Gwinnett County, Georgia, a sanitation worker made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While emptying a dumpster at an apartment complex in Lawrenceville, he spotted what appeared to be a small body wrapped in trash bags. He immediately called 911. When Gwinnett County police arrived and carefully unwrapped the bags, they found the remains of a young girl. She was severely emaciated, weighing only 32 pounds. She appeared to be approximately 6 or 7 years old. Her body showed signs of extensive physical trauma, malnutrition, and abuse. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been dead for several days before being discovered. The investigation began immediately. Who was this child? Where did she come from? How did she end up in a dumpster? The apartment complex where she was found had dozens of units, and investigators began the painstaking process of canvassing residents and reviewing security footage. The breakthrough came quickly. Surveillance cameras had captured footage of a man disposing of heavy trash bags in the dumpster during the early morning hours of November 1st. Investigators identified the man from the footage and traced him to a nearby apartment. His name was Imani Moss. When police knocked on Imani Moss's door, they were met by both Imani and his wife, Tiffany Moss. When asked if they had children, the couple's behavior immediately raised red flags. They were nervous, evasive, and their stories didn't align. Under questioning, they admitted they had a daughter named Imani Moss who was 10 years old. When investigators asked where Imani was, the couple's answer would shock even experienced homicide detectives. She was dead, and they had disposed of her body in the dumpster. Imani Moss was born on April 19, 2003, in Georgia. Her biological mother was not in her life, and her father, Imani Moss, had full custody of her. Tiffany Moss was actually Imani's stepmother, having married Imani when Imani was young. The family lived in a small apartment in Lawrenceville, a suburb northeast of Atlanta. To neighbors and outsiders, they appeared to be a normal family. But inside the apartment, Imani was living in hell. The investigation would reveal that Imani had been systematically tortured, starved, and abused for years. While Imani and Tiffany's 2 biological children were well-fed, healthy, and appropriately cared for, Imani was treated like a prisoner in her own home. Imani was denied adequate food for extended periods. She was kept in a bedroom that had been modified with locks to prevent her from leaving or accessing food. Witnesses reported that Imani appeared emaciated and unhealthy in the months before her death, but no one reported the abuse to authorities. The other children in the household were explicitly prohibited from sharing their food with Imani. The medical examiner determined that Imani died from starvation and dehydration. At 10 years old, she weighed only 32 pounds, less than the average weight of a 2-year-old child. Her body showed signs of chronic malnutrition, with muscle wasting and evidence of prolonged suffering. She also had burn marks and other injuries consistent with physical abuse. The autopsy revealed something even more horrifying. Imani's stomach was completely empty at the time of her death. She had been denied food for so long that her body had begun consuming its own muscle tissue in a desperate attempt to survive. She had quite literally starved to death while living in an apartment with a fully stocked kitchen. Both Imani Moss and Tiffany Moss were arrested and charged with murder, cruelty to children, and concealing a death. They were held without bond at the Gwinnett County Detention Center. The prosecution faced a complex challenge, proving which parent was primarily responsible or whether both were equally culpable. Georgia law allows for accomplice liability, meaning that someone who aids or assists in a crime can be held as responsible as the person who directly commits it. Imani Moss, Imani's biological father, was tried first. His trial began in 2015. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of his failure to protect his daughter and his active participation in her abuse. Witnesses testified that he had been seen punishing Imani by withholding food. Medical experts explained the prolonged suffering Imani endured. The defense argued that Imam Moss had mental health issues and had been manipulated by his wife, Tiffany. They painted Tiffany as the primary aggressor, the evil stepmother who convinced Iman to mistreat his own daughter. They argued that Iman was guilty of neglect, but not murder. The jury disagreed. On August 28, 2015, Iman Moss was convicted of murder and multiple counts of child cruelty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences. Tiffany Moss's case took a different turn. Prosecutors decided to seek the death penalty against her, making her eligible for capital punishment if convicted. Her trial was delayed multiple times due to various legal issues, including competency evaluations and defense motions. One of the most unusual aspects of Tiffany Moss's case was her decision to represent herself during the trial. Against the strong advice of the judge and court-appointed advisory counsel, Tiffany insisted on acting as her own attorney. This decision would prove catastrophic for her defense. The trial began in April 2019, nearly 6 years after Imani's death. The evidence presented was even more detailed and disturbing than in Iman's trial. Prosecutors showed photos of Imani taken weeks before her death, showing her severe emaciation. They presented evidence that Tiffany had actively participated in starving Imani, had prevented others from feeding her, and had helped dispose of her body. Because Tiffany was representing herself, she had the opportunity to cross-examine witnesses, present opening and closing statements, and call witnesses on her own behalf. But she essentially mounted no defense. She asked few questions during cross-examination. She presented no witnesses. In her closing argument, she spoke for less than 2 minutes. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, including malice murder. The sentencing phase began immediately. In Georgia death penalty cases, the jury must unanimously find the existence of at least one statutory aggravating circumstance beyond a reasonable doubt before they can impose a death sentence. In Tiffany Moss's case, prosecutors argued multiple aggravating factors including the victim's young age, the torture involved, and the heinous nature of the crime. The jury took less than 1 day to reach their decision. On April 30, 2019, they recommended that Tiffany Moss be sentenced to death for the murder of Imani Moss. Judge George Hutchinson accepted the jury's recommendation and formally imposed the death sentence. Tiffany Moss became only the second woman on Georgia's death row at that time, and she remains there today while her case goes through the lengthy appeals process that all capital cases undergo. The case of Imani Moss shocked Georgia and the nation. It raised serious questions about how a child could be so obviously abused without intervention from neighbors, teachers, or family members. It sparked discussions about mandatory reporting laws and the responsibility of community members to report suspected child abuse. For the Gwinnett County community, Imani's case became a symbol of the worst kind of parental betrayal. At Imani's funeral, which was held long after her death due to the investigation, hundreds of people attended to pay their respects to a little girl they had never met, but whose suffering touched them deeply. The Imani Moss case represents one of the most severe examples of child torture and starvation in Georgia's criminal history. The systematic nature of the abuse, the fact that it occurred while other children in the same household were well cared for, and the complete absence of remorse from the perpetrators make this case particularly disturbing. Make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Silent Files so you don't miss future investigations. And if you have thoughts about these cases, we encourage you to share them respectfully in the comments. Case 3. Sophia Williams. The murder of Cameron Irvin Carter, DeKalb County, Georgia, 2016. On October 14, 2016, firefighters in DeKalb County, Georgia, responded to a townhouse fire in Lithonia, a community in the eastern part of the county. The fire was intense, requiring multiple units to bring it under control. Once the flames were extinguished, firefighters entered the structure to check for victims. What they found in an upstairs bedroom was heartbreaking. The body of a young boy, later identified as 16-year-old Cameron Irvin Carter, was discovered. He appeared to have died from smoke inhalation and burns sustained in the fire. His body was transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy and positive identification. The boy's mother, Sophia Williams, was at the scene and appeared distraught. She told investigators that she had been out of the house when the fire started and had returned to find her home in flames. She said she tried to get inside to save her son, but was unable to reach him due to the intensity of the fire. It was a tragic story, a mother losing her teenage son in an accidental house fire. These incidents happen, unfortunately, and investigators initially treated it as a standard fire investigation to determine the cause and origin. But as fire investigators examined the scene more closely, they found something troubling. The burn patterns and fire dynamics didn't match an accidental fire. There were multiple points of origin, suggesting the fire had been intentionally set. Accelerant detection dogs alerted to possible gasoline or other flammable liquid residue in multiple locations. The investigation quickly shifted from an accidental fire to a potential arson and homicide investigation, and the focus turned to Sophia Williams. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they uncovered a disturbing history. Cameron Irvin Carter was Sophia Williams's biological son, but their relationship had been troubled for years. Records showed multiple Department of Family and Children's Services reports concerning the household, including allegations of physical abuse. Witnesses came forward with shocking information. They reported that Sophia Williams had a history of physically abusing Cameron and that the abuse had escalated in the months before his death. Some witnesses reported seeing bruises and injuries on Cameron. Others reported hearing Sophia making threats against her son. Perhaps most disturbing were reports that Sophia had previously attempted to harm Cameron. The investigation revealed that approximately 1 month before the fatal fire, there had been a previous fire at the same residence. That fire had been relatively minor and was quickly extinguished, but investigators now had to consider whether it had been a previous attempt on Cameron's life that had failed. The medical examiner's findings added another layer to the case. While Cameron had indeed died from smoke inhalation and burns, the autopsy revealed that he also had injuries consistent with physical trauma that occurred before the fire. He had bruising and other wounds that suggested he had been beaten shortly before his death. The timeline investigators established was chilling. They believed that Sophia Williams had assaulted Cameron in the townhouse, rendering him unable to escape or defend himself. She then deliberately set multiple fires throughout the residence, knowing that Cameron was inside and unable to get out. She left the townhouse and waited for a period of time before discovering the fire and calling 911, creating the appearance that she had been away when it started. On November 4, 2016, less than 3 weeks after Cameron's death, Sophia Williams was arrested and charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and arson in the first degree. The DeKalb County District Attorney's Office announced that they would prosecute the case vigorously and seek the maximum penalties under Georgia law. The indictment alleged that Sophia Williams had unlawfully and with malice aforethought caused the death of Cameron Irvin Carter by setting fire to the residence where he was located, knowing he was inside and unable to escape. It alleged that she had assaulted him before setting the fires, further ensuring he could not save himself. As news of the charges spread, the community was shocked. Cameron had attended local schools and had friends and extended family members who couldn't believe what they were hearing. He was remembered as a good kid who had struggled with a difficult home situation, but who had dreams and potential. The legal proceedings moved forward through the court system. Sophia Williams pleaded not guilty to all charges and was held without bond while awaiting trial. Her defense attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that prosecutors could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Sophia had intentionally killed her son. But prosecutors had built a strong case. They had forensic evidence from the fire investigation showing arson. They had medical evidence showing Cameron had been assaulted before his death. They had witnesses who testified about Sophia's abusive behavior and threats against Cameron. And they had Sophia's own statements, which contained inconsistencies and changed over time as investigators confronted her with evidence. The trial of Sophia Williams took place in DeKalb County Superior Court. The proceedings were covered extensively by local media, including WSB-TV, 11 Alive, and Atlanta News First. The case drew attention not just because of the nature of the crime, but because it represented a particularly egregious example of parental abuse resulting in death. The prosecution's case was comprehensive. Fire investigators testified about the arson evidence, explaining to the jury how they determined the fire had been intentionally set. The medical examiner testified about Cameron's injuries and the cause of death. DFCS workers and school officials testified about the history of abuse and the warning signs that had been present. One of the most emotional moments in the trial came when Cameron's friends and other family members testified. They described a young man who had endured more than anyone should have to endure from a parent. They talked about his personality, his hopes, his struggles. They gave Cameron a voice in a courtroom where he could no longer speak for himself. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt by questioning the timeline and suggesting that perhaps the fire had been accidental or set by someone other than Sophia. They portrayed Sophia as a struggling single mother who may have made mistakes, but was not a murderer. They argued that the abuse allegations were exaggerated and that Cameron's death was a tragic accident, not a deliberate homicide. The jury didn't buy it. After hearing all the evidence and deliberating on the case, they found Sophia Williams guilty of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and first-degree arson. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison. At sentencing, the judge addressed Sophia Williams directly. He spoke about the special trust and duty that parents have to protect their children, not harm them. He noted that Cameron had been particularly vulnerable, living in his mother's home with no other parent to protect him, and that Sophia had exploited that vulnerability in the worst possible way. Sophia Williams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder counts, plus additional consecutive sentences for the other charges. She was transported to a Georgia State Women's Correctional Facility to begin serving her sentence. The DeKalb County District Attorney released a statement after the conviction, expressing satisfaction with the verdict, but noting that no amount of justice could bring Cameron back or undo the suffering he endured. The statement also highlighted the importance of reporting suspected child abuse and the need for community vigilance. The case of Cameron Irvin Carter and Sophia Williams raised important questions about child protective services and how cases of suspected abuse are handled. Records showed that there had been multiple reports to DFCS concerning Cameron's welfare in the years before his death. Investigations had been conducted, but Cameron remained in his mother's custody until the day she killed him. This isn't unique to Cameron's case. Many child homicide cases involve children who were known to protective services but remained in dangerous situations. The reasons are complex. Caseworkers are overburdened. Evidence of abuse can be difficult to substantiate to the legal standard required for removal, and parents often know how to present well during investigations. Cameron's case became a rallying point for advocates pushing for reforms in Georgia's child protective system. They called for lower caseloads for DFCS workers, better training in recognizing escalating danger, and legal reforms that would make it easier to remove children from genuinely dangerous situations. For the DeKalb County community, particularly the Lithonia area where Cameron lived and died, his case left deep scars. A memorial was established near the site of the fire, with flowers, candles, and messages remembering Cameron and calling for justice for abused children everywhere. The Sophia Williams case represents a particularly cruel form of maternal homicide, the deliberate killing of a child who had already endured years of abuse at his mother's hands. The use of fire as the murder weapon, ensuring a painful death, and the attempt to make it appear accidental show a level of calculation and cruelty that places this case among the most disturbing in Georgia's history. Case 4. Candice Crocker and Kimberly Wright. The Effingham County Family Murders, Effingham County, Georgia, 2008. December 24, 2008, Christmas Eve, should have been a day of celebration and family togetherness in Effingham County, Georgia. Instead, it became the day of one of the most brutal family murders in the county's history. Craig Height was at his father's home in the rural Effingham County community of Springfield when he heard gunshots. Racing toward the sound, he discovered a scene of absolute carnage. His father, Philip Height, aged 59, and his brother, Kerry Height, aged 32, had both been shot multiple times. His mother, Linda Height, had also been shot and was critically wounded. Emergency responders arrived to find Philip Height dead at the scene from multiple gunshot wounds. Wright was also deceased, having been shot in the face and chest at close range. Linda Wright was barely alive, having been shot in the face, but miraculously she survived and was transported to a trauma center for emergency treatment. Wright was unharmed, though he would later become a person of interest in the investigation. The Effingham County Sheriff's Office launched an immediate homicide investigation, working with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to process the complex crime scene. The Wright family was well known in Effingham County. Philip Wright was a respected businessman and landowner. The family had lived in the area for generations. The brutality and timing of the murders sent shockwaves through the community. Who would execute two members of a prominent family on Christmas Eve? The investigation would eventually reveal a twisted plot involving forbidden love, manipulation, and two women who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. As investigators delved into the case, they focused on the complex relationships within and around the Wright family. At the center of the investigation were two women, Kimberly Wright and Candice Crocker. Candice Crocker was married to Terri Wright at the time of the murders. She was the mother of 3 children and appeared to be a typical suburban Georgia mother. But investigators learned that Candice had been having an extramarital affair with Wright, her husband's own brother. The affair had been ongoing for some time and was apparently known to some family members, creating tension within the Wright family. Kimberly Wright was a friend of the Wright family, but had her own complicated connections. Investigators discovered that Kimberly had a romantic interest in Wright and was aware of his affair with Candice. The 3 of them, Craig, Candice, and Kimberly, formed a toxic triangle that would ultimately result in murder. The theory that prosecutors developed was this. Wright wanted to be with Candice permanently, but she was married to his brother. Terri Wright and Philip Wright both disapproved of the affair and were pressuring it to end. Craig, Candice, and Kimberly allegedly conspired together to kill Terri and Philip, eliminating the obstacles to the relationship and potentially giving Candice access to inheritance money from Terry's estate. Linda Wright, who survived the attack, provided crucial testimony. Despite being shot in the face, she had maintained enough awareness to hear and see aspects of the attack. Her descriptions of the assailants and the events of that night corroborated the prosecution's theory. The investigation was lengthy and complex. Forensic evidence from the crime scene was meticulously analyzed. Ballistics experts traced the weapons used. Phone records showed communications between Craig, Candice, and Kimberly in the days leading up to the murders. Financial records revealed potential motives related to inheritance and life insurance. On December 29, 2008, just 5 days after the murders, Wright was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of aggravated assault. His arrest sent shockwaves through Effingham County. A son and brother murdering his own family members was almost incomprehensible. But prosecutors believed Craig hadn't acted alone. They continued investigating Candice Crocker and Kimberly Wright's involvement. The evidence showed that both women had knowledge of the planned attack and had actively participated in planning it. Prosecutors alleged that they had encouraged Craig to carry out the murders and had helped him prepare. In Georgia, accomplice liability means that someone who helps plan or facilitate a murder can be charged with murder even if they don't pull the trigger themselves. Prosecutors decided to charge both Candice Crocker and Kimberly Wright with murder and conspiracy. The arrests of 2 women, including the victim's own widow, added another layer of shock to an already horrifying case. How could a wife be involved in murdering her own husband? How could these women, both mothers themselves, participate in planning such brutal violence? Wright's trial came first. In April 2010, he was tried in Effingham County Superior Court. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Craig's own inconsistent statements to investigators. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that investigators had focused on Craig while overlooking other potential suspects. The jury didn't believe the defense. Wright was convicted of all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders, plus additional time for the assault on his mother, Linda Wright. Kimberly Wright's case took an interesting turn. Facing the evidence against her and the prospect of a lengthy trial that could result in life in prison, Wright decided to cooperate with prosecutors. She agreed to testify against Candice Crocker in exchange for a plea deal. In her agreement, She pleaded guilty to lesser charges and received a significantly reduced sentence. Wright's cooperation was crucial to the prosecution's case against Candice Crocker. She provided insider details about the planning of the murders, the motivations, and Candice's specific role in encouraging and facilitating the crime. Her testimony would prove devastating to Candice's defense. Candice Crocker's trial began in September 2010. The courtroom was packed with community members, media, and family members on both sides of this tragic case. Candice faced 2 counts of murder and multiple counts of conspiracy and being a party to a crime. The prosecution's case against Candice Crocker was built on multiple types of evidence. First, there was the forensic and circumstantial evidence tying her to knowledge of the planned attack. Phone records showed communications between Candice, Craig, and Kimberly in the critical days before Christmas Eve 2008. Second, there was the testimony of Kimberly Wright, who described conversations where Candice had discussed wanting Carrie out of the picture and had expressed support for Craig's plan to eliminate the family members who opposed their relationship. Wright testified that Candice had been aware of the specific timing and nature of the planned attack. Third, there was the testimony of Linda Height, the survivor. Though her physical wounds had healed, the emotional trauma was evident as she testified about losing her husband and son. She described the family dynamics and the tension created by Craig and Candice's affair. She recounted how Carrie had been trying to save his marriage despite Candice's betrayal. Fourth, there were financial records showing that Candice stood to benefit substantially from Carrie's death through life insurance policies and potential inheritance from the Height family estate. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who was so consumed by her affair and her desire to be with Craig that she was willing to eliminate her own husband, the father of her children. They argued that Candice had actively participated in planning the murders and had encouraged Craig to carry them out, making her just as culpable under Georgia law as if she had fired the shots herself. The defense strategy was to minimize Candice's involvement and portray her as a victim of Craig's manipulation. Defense attorneys argued that Candice had been aware of Craig's violent intentions but had not believed he would actually carry them out. They suggested that she was guilty of poor judgment in maintaining the affair and perhaps failing to warn family members, but that she was not guilty of murder. They attacked Kimberly Wright's credibility, pointing out that she had received a favorable plea deal in exchange for her testimony and therefore had motivation to exaggerate Candice's involvement. They argued that the prosecution was relying too heavily on the word of someone who had admitted to her own criminal involvement. But the prosecution had corroborating evidence beyond Wright's testimony. The phone records, financial motives, and Candice's own statements to investigators contained inconsistencies that suggested guilty knowledge. The jury heard evidence that in the immediate aftermath of the murders, when most people would be in shock and grief, Candice had been more concerned with continuing her relationship with Craig than with grieving her husband or comforting her children. The trial lasted several weeks. The jury heard from dozens of witnesses and reviewed hundreds of pieces of evidence. The deliberations were lengthy, suggesting that jurors were taking their responsibilities seriously and carefully weighing all the evidence. On September 24, 2010, the jury returned its verdict. They found Candice Crocker guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of malice murder for the deaths of Philip Height and Carrie Height. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison. At the sentencing hearing, the judge heard impact statements from Linda Height and other surviving family members. They described the devastation wrought by these murders, not just the loss of Philip and Carrie, but the destruction of the entire family structure. Holidays would forever be marked by the memory of what happened on Christmas Eve 2008. The children in the family had lost their father and grandfather, and the person responsible was their own mother. The judge sentenced Candice Crocker to life in prison without the possibility of parole for each murder count, with the sentences to run consecutively. This meant that even if one conviction were somehow overturned on appeal, she would still be serving life without parole for the other. Additional sentences for the conspiracy and party to a crime charges were added consecutively as well. Candice Crocker showed little emotion during the sentencing. She made a brief statement maintaining her innocence but accepting the court's judgment. She was transported to Pulaski State Prison, a women's correctional facility in Georgia, where she remains incarcerated today. Kimberly Wright, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received a sentence of 10 years, of which she served approximately 6 years before being released on parole. Her cooperation and her lesser role in the actual planning and execution of the murders were taken into account in her sentencing. The Effingham County murders became one of the most notorious cases in the region's history. The case has been featured on numerous true crime television programs, including episodes of Dateline NBC and other investigative shows. It has been analyzed by legal experts and criminologists as an example of how extramarital affairs and family conflicts can escalate to unthinkable violence. For the Haight family, the tragedy destroyed multiple generations. Linda Haight lost her husband and one son, while another son was convicted of murdering them. Her grandchildren lost their father and were left with the knowledge that their mother participated in his murder. The extended Haight family was torn apart, with some members supporting Craig and Candice and others seeking justice. The Springfield community, where the Haight's had lived for generations, struggled to understand how such violence could erupt within what had appeared to be a successful, established family. What makes this case particularly relevant to this documentary is the active role that both Candice Crocker and Kimberly Wright played in the murders. While Craig Haight was the one who physically pulled the trigger, both women were convicted of participating in the planning and facilitation of these crimes. The prosecution's case suggested that without the women's encouragement and support, Craig might not have carried out the murders. Candice, in particular, stood to gain significantly from her husband's death, both financially and personally, as it removed the primary obstacle to her relationship with Craig. The case represents a form of maternal criminality that is less direct than some other cases in this documentary, but no less culpable under the law. Candice Crocker's children lost their father, and their mother was responsible. She chose her illicit relationship over her responsibilities as a wife and mother. She chose to participate in planning his murder rather than seeking a divorce or dealing with her marital problems through legal means. Both Candice Crocker and Kimberly Wright remain part of Georgia's criminal history as examples of how maternal figures can become perpetrators of the worst kinds of family violence. Case 5. Stephanie Danielle Davis. The death of Jayla Davis, Bartow County, Georgia, 2017. On September 1, 2017, emergency dispatchers in Cartersville, Georgia, received a frantic 911 call from a young woman named Stephanie Danielle Davis. She reported that her 6-month-old daughter, Jayla Davis, was not breathing and appeared to be unresponsive. Paramedics were dispatched immediately to the residence in Bartow County. When they arrived, they found baby Jayla in critical condition. She had no pulse and was not breathing. The paramedics began emergency resuscitation efforts and transported her to a nearby hospital with lights and sirens. At the hospital, doctors worked desperately to save Jayla's life, but the injuries she had sustained were too severe. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, Jayla Davis was pronounced deceased shortly after arrival. She was only 6 months old. The medical staff immediately noticed something concerning. Jayla's injuries were not consistent with natural causes or with the explanation that Stephanie Davis had initially provided. There were signs of trauma, bruising, hemorrhaging, and other injuries that suggested she had been subjected to violent force. Hospital staff, as they are mandated to do under Georgia law, contacted the Cartersville Police Department to report their suspicions. What had started as a medical emergency call quickly became a death investigation with potential criminal implications. Detectives from the Cartersville Police Department responded to the hospital to interview Stephanie Davis and to begin piecing together what had happened to Jayla. Stephanie, who was 21 years old at the time, gave an initial account that raised immediate red flags. She claimed that Jayla had been fine earlier in the day, but had suddenly become unresponsive. She said she hadn't witnessed any trauma or accident that would explain the injuries. Her story was vague on key details and contained inconsistencies that experienced investigators recognized as potential deception indicators. Meanwhile, the medical examiner's office conducted an autopsy on Jayla's tiny body. The findings were devastating and unambiguous. Jayla had died from blunt force trauma to the head. She had sustained multiple injuries consistent with being violently shaken and struck. She had skull fractures, brain hemorrhaging, and internal injuries. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death a homicide. This was not an accident. This was not sudden infant death syndrome. This was not a medical condition. Jayla Davis had been murdered. The investigation intensified. Detectives conducted a thorough examination of the Davis residence, looking for evidence of what had occurred. They interviewed family members, neighbors, and anyone who had contact with Stephanie and Jayla in the days before the infant's death. What emerged was a troubling picture. Stephanie Davis was a young, single mother who had been struggling with the demands of caring for an infant. Friends and family members reported that she had expressed frustration with Jayla's crying and with the challenges of motherhood. Some witnesses reported that they had concerns about how Stephanie was coping but hadn't witnessed any overt abuse. As the investigation progressed, detectives re-interviewed Stephanie Davis, this time confronting her with the medical evidence. They explained that the injuries Jayla had sustained were not consistent with her initial explanation. They explained that the medical examiner had ruled this a homicide. They gave Stephanie the opportunity to tell the truth about what had happened. Under the pressure of the interrogation and faced with irrefutable medical evidence, Stephanie's story began to change. She admitted that she had become frustrated with Jayla's crying on the day of her death. She admitted that she had lost her temper. She admitted that she had shaken Jayla violently and may have struck her, though her exact description of the assault varied in different retellings. What was clear was that Stephanie Davis had subjected her 6-month-old daughter to a violent assault that resulted in fatal injuries. Whether the assault lasted seconds or minutes, whether it involved shaking alone or shaking combined with impact, the result was the same. Jayla Davis had died at the hands of her own mother. On September 5, 2017, just 4 days after Jayla's death, Stephanie Danielle Davis was arrested and charged with murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, and cruelty to children in the first degree. She was held without bond at the Bartow County Detention Center. The Bartow County District Attorney's Office took on the case with the full weight of their resources. Prosecuting the murder of an infant is always emotionally challenging, but they were determined to seek justice for Jayla. The evidence was strong. The medical examiner testified about the specific nature of Jayla's injuries and explained to the jury that these injuries could only have been caused by violent force applied by another person. They could not have been accidental or self-inflicted. The doctor used medical terminology to describe skull fractures, subdural hematomas, and diffuse axonal injury, all terms that painted a picture of severe trauma to a developing infant brain. Detectives testified about their investigation, including the initial inconsistent statements from Stephanie Davis and her eventual admissions. The recordings of police interviews were played for the jury, allowing them to hear Stephanie's changing accounts and her ultimate confession that she had harmed Jayla. The prosecution also presented evidence about Stephanie's state of mind and her capacity to care for Jayla. While they acknowledged that being a young single mother is difficult, they argued that frustration with a crying baby is never an excuse for violence. They pointed out that Stephanie had resources available to her, family members who could have helped, social services, even the simple option of placing Jayla in a safe location and walking away for a few minutes to calm down. The defense faced a nearly impossible task. With Stephanie's own admissions and the clear medical evidence, they couldn't argue innocence. Instead, they attempted to mitigate the charges, arguing that Stephanie hadn't intended to kill Jayla and that the appropriate charge was manslaughter rather than murder. They presented evidence of Stephanie's youth, her lack of support systems, and her struggles with the demands of motherhood. They brought in experts to discuss shaken baby syndrome and how parents sometimes don't realize the danger of shaking an infant. They argued that Stephanie had acted out of frustration in a moment of lost control, not with malice or premeditation. The trial took place in Bartow County Superior Court. Local media, including WSB-TV and Northwest Georgia News, covered the proceedings. The case resonated with the community because it represented every parent's worst nightmare, a helpless infant killed by the person who should have protected her most. The jury deliberated on the evidence and the legal definitions of the various charges. In Georgia, malice murder requires that the defendant acted with malice aforethought, essentially, an intent to kill or conscious disregard for human life. Felony murder can occur when someone dies during the commission of certain felonies, including child cruelty. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. They found Stephanie Danielle Davis guilty of felony murder and cruelty to children in the first degree. They acquitted her of the malice murder charge, apparently accepting the defense argument that she hadn't specifically intended to kill Jayla, but they found her guilty of causing Jayla's death during the commission of child cruelty. The verdict meant that Stephanie Davis faced a mandatory life sentence. At the sentencing hearing, family members had the opportunity to provide victim impact statements. Jayla's father, other relatives, and community members spoke about the devastating loss of this innocent infant whose life had barely begun. The judge sentenced Stephanie Davis to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years for the felony murder conviction, plus additional consecutive time for the child cruelty conviction. The sentence meant that Stephanie would be in her 50s before even being eligible to appear before a parole board. Stephanie Davis was transported to Pulaski State Prison to begin serving her sentence. She remains incarcerated there today. The death of Jayla Davis falls into a category of infant homicides often referred to as shaken baby syndrome, or more accurately, abusive head trauma. Medical professionals have extensively studied this phenomenon, which is unfortunately more common than many people realize. Infants are particularly vulnerable to head injuries because their neck muscles are not strong enough to support their relatively large heads. Their brain tissue is still developing and is more susceptible to damage, and their skulls have not fully hardened. When an infant is violently shaken, the brain can move within the skull, causing tearing of blood vessels and brain tissue. The results can be fatal or can cause permanent brain damage, blindness, seizures, and developmental disabilities. Studies have shown that the majority of abusive head trauma cases involve a caregiver, often a parent, who becomes frustrated with an infant's crying and responds with violence. The perpetrator often doesn't intend to kill the child and may not even realize how dangerous shaking can be. But ignorance is not a defense, and the results are tragically the same. Public health campaigns have worked to educate new parents about the dangers of shaking babies and about strategies for dealing with infant crying. Organizations like the National Center on Shaken Baby Syndrome provide resources for parents who are struggling. The message is clear. If you're feeling overwhelmed by a crying baby, put the baby in a safe place like a crib and walk away. Call someone for help. Take a break. But never, ever shake a baby. Jayla Davis's case became part of these educational efforts in Georgia. Healthcare providers in Bartow County and surrounding areas used her case as a tragic example in their parenting education programs, hoping that future deaths could be prevented. The death of Jayla Davis affected many people beyond her immediate family. The Cartersville community mourned the loss of a child they had never met. Healthcare providers who tried to save Jayla were traumatized by their inability to do so. First responders who arrived at the scene carried the memory of that day. For Jayla's extended family, including her father and grandparents, the loss was compounded by the knowledge that Stephanie, someone they had trusted to care for Jayla, had been the one to kill her. Family members struggled with guilt, wondering if they could have intervened earlier or provided more support to Stephanie. Stephanie Davis represents a type of maternal offender who doesn't carefully plan violence, but rather explodes in a moment of frustration with devastating consequences. Unlike some other cases in this documentary where abuse was prolonged and systematic, Jayla's death appears to have resulted from an acute violent incident. But the end result is the same: a dead child and a mother behind bars. We're halfway through this documentary, and I want to thank you for staying with these difficult stories. Please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to True Crime Silent Files. Your engagement truly matters. Case 6. Sonya Smith. The Forsyth County Child Torture Case. Forsyth County, Georgia, 2007. In April 2007, social workers in Forsyth County, Georgia, received a report that would lead them to one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse in the state's history. The report concerned the Smith family, who lived in an affluent suburb north of Atlanta. From the outside, the Smith family appeared to embody the American dream. They lived in a nice home in a good neighborhood. Sonya Smith, the mother, was articulate and presented herself as a devoted parent. Her husband was a working professional. They had multiple children and appeared to be a typical suburban family. But when investigators actually entered the Smith home, they found something that contradicted this perfect facade entirely. They found children living in conditions of extreme neglect and abuse. They found evidence of systematic torture. And they found a mother who had orchestrated years of cruelty against her own children. The initial investigation was prompted by concerns raised by school officials about one of the Smith children. Teachers had noticed unexplained injuries, significant weight loss, and behavioral issues that suggested serious problems at home. When the school counselor spoke with the child, concerning details emerged that led to an immediate referral to the Department of Family and Children Services. When DFCS investigators, accompanied by law enforcement, executed a welfare check at the Smith residence, what they found shocked them despite years of experience in child protective services. Several of the Smith children showed signs of severe malnutrition, physical abuse, and psychological trauma. The investigation revealed that Sonya Smith had created a hierarchy among her children. Some were favored and treated relatively well. Others, particularly those from her husband's previous relationships, were subjected to systematic abuse and torture. The abused children were denied adequate food, while the favored children ate normally. They were locked in rooms for extended periods. They were subjected to physical punishments that went far beyond reasonable discipline, including beatings, burning, and other forms of torture. They were isolated from the outside world and from each other. Medical examinations of the children revealed evidence of chronic malnutrition, healing and healed fractures in various stages, burn scars, and other injuries consistent with long-term abuse. The children were significantly underweight for their ages, and some showed developmental delays consistent with prolonged neglect. Perhaps most disturbing was the psychological abuse. The children had been conditioned to lie about their injuries and living conditions. They had been threatened with worse punishment if they told anyone what was happening. They had been taught that their suffering was deserved, that they were bad children who warranted this treatment. The investigation expanded to interview teachers, neighbors, and extended family members. Several people reported that they had sensed something was wrong with the Smith household, but hadn't known the extent of the abuse. Some had noticed that certain Smith children looked thin or unhealthy, but had accepted Sonya's explanations about medical conditions or picky eating. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they uncovered a pattern of abuse that had lasted for years. Sonya Smith had exercised complete control over her household, creating an environment where abuse could occur hidden from outside scrutiny. The children reported being denied food as punishment for minor infractions, or sometimes for no reason at all. They described being given food that was insufficient or spoiled while watching the favored children eat regular meals. Some reported being forced to eat food that had been mixed with unpleasant substances as a form of humiliation. Physical abuse was frequent and severe. Children described beatings with various objects including belts, wooden spoons, and extension cords. They described being burned with cigarettes or hot objects. They described being forced to maintain painful positions for extended periods as punishment. The psychological abuse was equally damaging. Children were told they were worthless, unloved, and deserved their mistreatment. They were isolated from siblings who might have provided support. They were prevented from forming normal social relationships outside the home. Sonya Smith had also manipulated her husband, convincing him that the harsh treatment was necessary discipline or that the children's injuries were self-inflicted or accidental. Whether he genuinely believed this or chose to turn a blind eye became a subject of investigation, but ultimately prosecutors determined that Sonya was the primary perpetrator and driving force behind the abuse. On April 17, 2007, Sonya Smith was arrested and charged with multiple counts of cruelty to children, aggravated assault, and aggravated battery. As the investigation continued and more evidence was gathered, additional charges were filed. The children were removed from the home and placed in foster care and with relatives. They required extensive medical treatment for their physical injuries and psychological counseling for the trauma they had endured. Some of the children had injuries that would require ongoing treatment for years. The case against Sonya Smith was overwhelming. Medical evidence documented the extent of the children's injuries. The children's own testimony, given through specially trained interviewers, provided detailed accounts of the abuse. Forensic evidence from the home corroborated the children's statements. The prosecution portrayed Sonya Smith as a sadistic individual who had enjoyed exercising power over vulnerable children. They argued that this wasn't a case of discipline that went too far or a struggling parent who made mistakes. This was deliberate, systematic torture that had occurred over years. The defense attempted to argue that Sonya had mental health issues that affected her judgment and behavior. They presented evidence that she had a difficult childhood herself, and may have been replicating patterns of abuse she had experienced. They argued for a sentence that would include treatment rather than pure punishment. But the evidence of the children's suffering was too powerful. The jury heard about children who had been starved until their bones were visible through their skin. They heard about burn scars and broken bones. They heard about children who had been taught to hate themselves because their mother told them they were worthless. Sonya Smith's trial took place in Forsyth County Superior Court. The proceedings were emotional and difficult, with some jurors visibly struggling as they heard the details of what the children had endured. After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Sonya Smith guilty on multiple counts of cruelty to children and related charges. The conviction carried a potential sentence of decades in prison. At the sentencing hearing, the courtroom heard victim impact statements from some of the now-grown children and from advocates who had worked with them. They described the long-term effects of the abuse, not just physical scars, but psychological trauma, difficulty forming trusting relationships, struggles with self-esteem, and ongoing mental health challenges. The judge, clearly moved by the testimony, imposed a lengthy sentence. Sonya Smith received consecutive sentences totaling decades in prison. She would not be eligible for parole for many years, ensuring that she could not harm any children during that time. Sonya Smith showed little remorse during the sentencing. She maintained that she had been a good mother who had disciplined her children appropriately. This lack of insight into the harm she had caused was noted by the court and by the mental health professionals who had evaluated her. The Smith children began the long process of healing after their removal from the abusive environment. Some were adopted by loving families. Others remained in foster care or with relatives. All required significant therapeutic support to address the trauma they had experienced. Child psychologists who worked with the Smith children described the challenge of helping children recover from parental abuse. When a parent, especially a mother, is the source of trauma, it fundamentally affects a child's sense of safety and trust. The children had to learn that not all adults would hurt them, that they deserved kindness and care, and that the abuse they suffered was not their fault. The physical recovery was significant, but in some ways more straightforward than the psychological recovery. With adequate nutrition, the children's weight normalized. Their injuries healed, but the psychological scars were deeper and longer lasting. Some of the Smith children have spoken publicly about their experiences as adults, participating in advocacy efforts to prevent child abuse and to improve the child welfare system. They've described their journey from victims to survivors to advocates, using their experiences to help others. The Sonya Smith case raised important questions about how child abuse can persist for years without intervention. Several people had noticed signs that something was wrong with the Smith children, but no one had taken action that led to intervention. Teachers had noticed issues but had accepted explanations from Sonya. Neighbors had sensed something was off but didn't want to interfere in another family's business. Extended family members had limited contact with the family and didn't see the full extent of the abuse. The case became a training example for educators, healthcare providers, and others who work with children. It highlighted the importance of being alert to signs of abuse, of asking follow-up questions when explanations don't quite make sense, and of taking action even when it feels uncomfortable. Georgia's mandatory reporting laws require certain professionals to report suspected child abuse. But the Smith case showed that knowledge of the law isn't enough. Professionals need training in recognizing the often subtle signs of abuse and the confidence to act on their concerns. The case also highlighted how abuse can occur even in affluent families that don't fit the stereotype of neglectful or abusive households. Sonya Smith's family lived in a nice neighborhood and appeared financially stable. This reminded investigators and the public that child abuse crosses all socioeconomic boundaries and that assumptions based on appearances can allow abuse to continue undetected. Sonya Smith remains incarcerated in Georgia today, serving her lengthy sentence. Her case has been featured in various true crime media, including mentions in discussions of Georgia's worst child abuse cases. It stands as a reminder of how a parent's responsibility to nurture and protect can be so completely perverted into systematic cruelty. Case 7. Evelyn Odom. The murder of Shannon Dedrick, Ben Hill County, Georgia, 2009. On October 27, 2009, in the small South Georgia town of Fitzgerald, 911 dispatchers received a missing child report. Evelyn Odom called to report that her 7-year-old granddaughter, Shannon Dedrick, had vanished from her home. Shannon had been living with her grandmother, Evelyn Odom, and Evelyn's boyfriend, Dennis Franklin. Shannon's mother had struggled with substance abuse and instability, and custody had been granted to Evelyn. Neighbors in Fitzgerald knew Shannon as a sweet but quiet child who was often seen with her grandmother. Evelyn's initial story was that Shannon had been playing in the yard and had simply disappeared. She claimed she had looked inside and outside the house, but couldn't find the little girl anywhere. The timeline she provided suggested Shannon had been missing for several hours before the 911 call was made, which immediately concerned investigators. The Fitzgerald Police Department, along with the Ben Hill County Sheriff's Office and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, launched an immediate search. Canine units, helicopters, and volunteers scoured the area around Evelyn's home and the surrounding neighborhoods. Given Shannon's age and the time she had been missing, investigators feared the worst. As the search continued into the night and the following days, the community rallied. Flyers with Shannon's photo were distributed throughout South Georgia. Local media covered the case extensively. Everyone hoped for Shannon's safe return, but as hours turned into days without any sign of the little girl, hope began to fade. As investigators interviewed Evelyn Odom repeatedly, they noticed significant inconsistencies in her account. Her timeline kept changing. Her description of Shannon's activities before she disappeared varied with each retelling. Her emotional responses seemed inappropriate, not the raw grief and panic one would expect from a grandmother whose granddaughter had vanished, but rather a calculated and controlled demeanor. Dennis Franklin, Evelyn's boyfriend who also lived in the home, was interviewed separately. His account of the day's events didn't match Evelyn's. He seemed nervous and evasive when asked about Shannon. Investigators sensed that both Evelyn and Dennis knew more than they were saying. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation brought in forensic specialists to examine the Odom residence. Cadaver dogs alerted inside the home, suggesting that a deceased person had been present there recently. Luminol testing revealed traces of blood that had been cleaned up. Forensic analysis of computers and cell phones revealed searches related to disposing of bodies and evading detection by law enforcement. As evidence accumulated, investigators confronted Evelyn and Dennis with what they had found. Under pressure, and with the evidence mounting against them, the truth finally emerged, but it wasn't what anyone wanted to hear. On November 9, 2009, nearly 2 weeks after Shannon was reported missing, Dennis Franklin provided a statement to investigators that was both a confession and an accusation. He admitted that Shannon Dedrick was dead and that her death had occurred in Evelyn Odom's home. He claimed that Evelyn had been the one who killed Shannon, and that he had helped dispose of the body under Evelyn's direction. According to Franklin's statement, Shannon had been subjected to abuse in the Odom household. On the day of her death, Evelyn had beaten Shannon severely in what she claimed was discipline for misbehavior. The beating was so severe that Shannon died from her injuries. Panicking, Evelyn and Dennis had conspired to cover up the death. They had concealed Shannon's body, cleaned the crime scene, and eventually disposed of her remains in a location they would later reveal to investigators. The missing child report had been an attempt to create a cover story and deflect suspicion away from themselves. Based on Franklin's statement and the forensic evidence, both Evelyn Odom and Dennis Franklin were arrested and charged with murder, cruelty to children, and concealing a death. The charges carried potential life sentences or even the death penalty. The search for Shannon's body led investigators to a wooded area in rural Ben Hill County. After an extensive search of the location Franklin had described, they made the heartbreaking discovery. Shannon Dedrick's remains were found concealed in the woods, her body showing signs of the trauma that had ended her young life. The cases of Evelyn Odom and Dennis Franklin proceeded through the legal system separately. Prosecutors had to decide how to approach each defendant, considering their respective roles in Shannon's death and the cover-up. Dennis Franklin's case moved forward first. His cooperation with investigators and his confession played a significant role in the prosecution strategy. Prosecutors offered Franklin a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against Evelyn Odom. The deal required him to plead guilty to lesser charges and to provide truthful testimony about what had happened to Shannon. Franklin accepted the plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to concealing a death and making false statements. In exchange for his cooperation, He received a significantly reduced sentence compared to what he would have faced if convicted of murder. The plea deal was controversial. Many in the community felt that Franklin was getting off too lightly for his role in Shannon's death and the cover-up. But prosecutors deemed his testimony essential to securing a conviction against Evelyn Odom, who they believed was the primary perpetrator. Evelyn Odom's trial began in 2011 in Ben Hill County Superior Court. The prosecution's case was built on multiple pillars of evidence. First, there was Dennis Franklin's testimony describing how Evelyn had beaten Shannon and how they had conspired to cover up the death. Second, there was the forensic evidence from the home showing that a violent incident had occurred there and that cleanup efforts had been made. Third, there was the evidence of Evelyn's inconsistent statements to investigators and her attempts to create a false narrative about Shannon's disappearance. The medical examiner testified about Shannon's injuries and the cause of death. The 7-year-old had suffered blunt force trauma consistent with severe beating. The injuries were not accidental. They were the result of intentional violence applied with significant force to a small child's body. Witnesses testified about the household dynamics. Neighbors reported that they had occasionally heard shouting from the Odom residence, but hadn't realized a child was being abused. Teachers from Shannon's school testified that Shannon had sometimes appeared withdrawn or sad, but they hadn't observed obvious signs of physical abuse. In hindsight, there were warning signs, but they had been subtle enough that no intervention occurred before it was too late. Evelyn Odom's defense team faced a challenging situation. The evidence against her was substantial, and Dennis Franklin's testimony was damning. They had to develop a strategy that could create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. The defense attacked Franklin's credibility, pointing out that he had received a favorable plea deal in exchange for his testimony, and therefore had motivation to lie or exaggerate Evelyn's role while minimizing his own. They suggested that Franklin might have been more involved in Shannon's death than he admitted and was now blaming everything on Evelyn to save himself. They also attempted to present Evelyn as a grandmother who had taken on the responsibility of raising Shannon when the child's mother couldn't. They argued that while Evelyn may have used corporal punishment, which, while controversial, is legal in Georgia within certain bounds, she hadn't intended to kill Shannon. They suggested that Shannon's death might have been an accident that occurred during discipline that went too far, rather than intentional murder. However, the prosecution's rebuttal was powerful. They pointed out that even if discipline had gone too far, the subsequent actions, concealing Shannon's body, lying to investigators, staging a missing child report, and continuing the deception for weeks, showed consciousness of guilt and deliberate criminal behavior. A grandmother who had accidentally caused a child's death during discipline would have called for help, not hidden the body in the woods, and lied to police. They also emphasized the severity of Shannon's injuries. The medical examiner testified that the level of force required to cause Shannon's injuries went far beyond anything that could be characterized as discipline. This was a beating that caused fatal trauma to a 7-year-old child. The trial lasted several weeks, with extensive testimony from dozens of witnesses. The jury heard evidence that was both technically complex and emotionally wrenching. They saw photos of Shannon alive, a smiling 7-year-old with her whole life ahead of her. And they heard about the violence that had ended that life. After deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. They found Evelyn Odom guilty of malice murder, felony murder, and cruelty to children in the first degree. The conviction meant that Evelyn faced a mandatory life sentence, with the judge deciding whether she would be eligible for parole. The sentencing hearing was emotional. Shannon's biological mother, despite her own struggles, testified about the loss of her daughter. She expressed guilt that she hadn't been able to care for Shannon herself, and that her decision to place Shannon with Evelyn had led to this tragedy. Other family members spoke about Shannon's personality, her love of playing outside, her innocence. The prosecutor argued for life without parole, emphasizing the vulnerability of the victim, the betrayal of trust involved when a grandmother kills her granddaughter, and the deliberate cover-up that showed a lack of remorse or conscience. The defense argued for life with the possibility of parole, suggesting that Evelyn was not beyond redemption and that she should have the opportunity to demonstrate rehabilitation. The judge sentenced Evelyn Odom to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the malice murder conviction, plus additional consecutive sentences for the other charges. He stated that the calculated nature of the cover-up and the vulnerability of the 7-year-old victim warranted the harshest possible sentence under Georgia law. Evelyn Odom was transported to Pulaski State Prison in Georgia to begin serving her sentence. She remains incarcerated there today, having exhausted most of her appeals. Dennis Franklin served his reduced sentence and was released after several years. His cooperation with prosecutors had resulted in the conviction of Evelyn Odom, which was the primary goal of the plea agreement. His release was controversial and remains a source of anger for some community members who believe he should have received a harsher punishment for his role in Shannon's death and cover-up. The small city of Fitzgerald, Georgia, was deeply affected by Shannon Dedrick's murder. With a population of less than 10,000 people, Fitzgerald is the kind of place where tragic events touch everyone. Many community members knew Shannon or her family. The volunteers who had searched for Shannon during those initial days when she was believed to be missing felt betrayed when they learned that Evelyn had known all along that Shannon was dead. A memorial for Shannon was established in Fitzgerald, with community members contributing flowers, toys, and messages. Local churches held services in Shannon's memory. The case became a rallying point for child abuse prevention efforts in South Georgia. Evelyn Odom's case represents a particular category of maternal figure crime. While Evelyn was not Shannon's biological mother, she had taken on the parental role and had legal custody of the child. In the context of this documentary on maternal crime in Georgia, her case is relevant because grandmothers who have custody of grandchildren occupy a mothering role and bear the same responsibilities. Shannon Dedrick deserved better. She deserved a safe home where she would be nurtured and protected. She deserved to grow up, go to school, make friends, and experience all the joys of childhood. Instead, she suffered and died at the hands of someone who should have loved and protected her. Case 8. Cortney Bell. The death of Darius Hawkins, DeKalb County, Georgia, 2004. On March 6, 2004, in DeKalb County, Georgia, emergency services received a call about an unresponsive child. 2-year-old Darius Hawkins was found not breathing at his home. Paramedics rushed to the scene and transported Darius to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, but despite aggressive medical intervention, the toddler was pronounced dead. The medical examination revealed that Darius had died from severe injuries consistent with child abuse. He had subdural hematoma, brain swelling, and other injuries that indicated trauma. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. At the time of Darius's death, he was in the care of Cortney Bell, who was the girlfriend of Darius's father. Cortney had been acting as a caregiver for Darius while his father was at work. The child's biological mother had limited custody and was not present when the fatal injuries occurred. Cortney Bell initially told investigators that Darius had fallen or had injured himself accidentally. But medical experts determined that the injuries Darius sustained were not consistent with an accidental fall. The pattern and severity of injuries indicated inflicted trauma. The investigation focused on Cortney Bell as the person who had been alone with Darius when the fatal injuries occurred. On March 9, 2004, just 3 days after Darius's death, Cortney Bell was arrested and charged with murder and cruelty to children. The case moved forward to trial in DeKalb County Superior Court. The prosecution presented medical evidence showing that Darius's injuries were inflicted, not accidental. They presented testimony about Cortney's sole access to Darius during the time when the fatal injuries must have occurred. They argued that Cortney had harmed Darius in a moment of frustration or anger and then had attempted to cover it up by claiming the injuries were accidental. The defense argued that the prosecution couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Cortney had intentionally harmed Darius. They suggested that Darius might have had a pre-existing medical condition that made him vulnerable to injury. They questioned the medical testimony and the certainty with which doctors could determine that trauma was inflicted rather than accidental. However, the jury was convinced by the prosecution's case. On May 12, 2005, after deliberation, they found Cortney Bell guilty of felony murder and cruelty to children. The judge sentenced her to life in prison for the murder conviction, with additional time for the child cruelty conviction. Cortney Bell was incarcerated to begin serving her sentence. For most people following the case, this seemed like the end of the story. Another tragic case of a child killed by a caregiver, justice served, and a lengthy prison sentence imposed. But this case was far from over. In fact, the legal journey was just beginning, and it would take a dramatic turn that few could have predicted. After her conviction, Cortney Bell's attorneys filed appeals challenging various aspects of the trial. They argued that there had been errors in the proceedings that had deprived Cortney of a fair trial. They challenged the admission of certain evidence. They argued that the jury instructions had been improper. Most notably, they argued that the trial court had improperly excluded evidence that might have supported the defense's theory that Darius's injuries could have been caused by something other than intentional abuse by Cortney. They contended that evidence about alternative explanations for the injuries should have been presented to the jury. The appeals process in criminal cases can take years, working through various levels of the court system. Cortney Bell's case made its way through the Georgia Court of Appeals and eventually to the Georgia Supreme Court. In a decision that shocked many observers, the Georgia Supreme Court ruled in 2008 that Cortney Bell had not received a fair trial. The court found that the trial judge had improperly excluded certain defense evidence, and that this error was significant enough to warrant reversing the conviction. The Supreme Court's ruling didn't mean that Cortney was found innocent. It meant that her conviction was overturned and that she would be entitled to a new trial where the excluded evidence would be admissible. This was a significant legal victory for Cortney, who had by this point served several years in prison for a conviction that had now been reversed. The DeKalb County District Attorney's Office faced a difficult decision. They could retry Cortney Bell, but the case was now several years old. Memories fade, witnesses move away, and evidence degrades over time. Additionally, they had to consider the ruling from the Supreme Court about what evidence would now be admissible. The medical evidence about Darius's injuries remained the same. He had died from trauma that doctors believed was inflicted. But the defense would now be able to present alternative theories and expert testimony that might create reasonable doubt in a jury's mind. Prosecutors also had to consider the practical realities. The case had already consumed significant resources. A new trial would require extensive preparation, expert witnesses, and a substantial investment of time and money. And there was no guarantee of a conviction, especially with the additional evidence that the defense would now be permitted to present. After careful consideration and consultation with Darius's family, the district attorney's office made a decision. Rather than proceed to a new trial, they would offer Cortney Bell a plea agreement. The agreement would require her to plead guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for a sentence of time served, meaning she would be released based on the years she had already spent incarcerated. This decision was controversial. Some viewed it as a pragmatic recognition of the challenges in retrying the case. Others, particularly those who believed strongly in Cortney's guilt, saw it as an injustice. A woman they believed had killed a 2-year-old child was being allowed to go free. Cortney Bell accepted the plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, maintaining that she hadn't intended to kill Darius but accepting responsibility for his death. Based on the time she had already served, she was released from custody in 2009. Her release generated significant media coverage. Local news outlets, including 11 Alive, WSB-TV, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, covered the story extensively. Legal analysts debated whether the plea deal was appropriate. Darius's biological mother expressed her pain at seeing Cortney released, feeling that justice had not been fully served. The Cortney Bell case is included in this documentary with an important caveat. Unlike the other cases discussed, where guilt has been definitively established through trial convictions that were upheld on appeal, Cortney's case ended ambiguously. Her original murder conviction was reversed, and she ultimately pleaded guilty only to involuntary manslaughter as part of a plea agreement. This means there's less certainty about exactly what happened to Darius Hawkins and what Cortney's role was. The medical evidence showed that Darius died from inflicted trauma, but questions remain about intent, about alternative explanations, and about the full circumstances of his death. What we know for certain is that a 2-year-old boy died while in Cortney Bell's care. We know that the medical examiner ruled his death a homicide. We know that Cortney was convicted at trial, but that conviction was reversed. And we know that she ultimately accepted a plea to involuntary manslaughter. The case illustrates how complex these matters can be. Not every case is clear-cut. Not every conviction stands on appeal. And sometimes the legal outcomes don't satisfy anyone's sense of justice. For Darius Hawkins's family, the case's outcome left many questions unanswered and wounds unhealed. For Cortney Bell, the years in prison and the stigma of the case have permanently marked her life, regardless of what actually happened that day in 2004. Case 9. Pharina Peterson and Terri Lynn Peterson. The murder of Christian Lee, Dougherty County, Georgia, 2001. On February 14, 2001, Valentine's Day, fire departments in Dougherty County, Georgia, responded to a mobile home fire in a rural area outside Albany. The fire was intense, and firefighters worked to bring it under control. Once the flames were extinguished, firefighters entered the structure to check for victims. Inside, they made a tragic discovery: the body of a young child. The victim was 7-year-old Christian Lee, who had been staying at the mobile home with his grandmother, Terri Lynn Peterson, and his mother, Pharina Peterson. The initial assumption was that Christian had died in an accidental fire, a tragedy, but not necessarily a crime. But as fire investigators examined the scene, they found evidence that the fire had been deliberately set. Burn patterns, accelerant residue, and multiple points of origin all indicated arson. The investigation quickly shifted from a fire inquiry to a homicide investigation, and the focus turned to the two women who had been caring for Christian, his mother and his grandmother. As investigators from the Dougherty County Sheriff's Office and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation interviewed Pharina Peterson and Terri Lynn Peterson, inconsistencies in their stories emerged. Their timelines didn't match. Their explanations for their whereabouts at the time the fire started kept changing, and their emotional responses seemed calculated rather than genuinely grief-stricken. The investigation revealed a troubling history. Christian Lee was a special needs child who required significant care and attention. Raising a special needs child can be challenging even in the best circumstances, with ample resources and support. But Pharina and Terri Lynn were struggling financially and emotionally. Investigators learned that in the months before Christian's death, both women had expressed frustration with caring for him. Some witnesses reported hearing them make shocking statements about wishing they didn't have to deal with Christian anymore. These statements, while disturbing, weren't necessarily evidence of intent to harm. Many overwhelmed caregivers express frustration without acting on it. But in the context of Christian's death, they took on sinister significance. The medical examiner determined that Christian had died from smoke inhalation and burns sustained in the fire. But the autopsy also revealed something else. Christian had sedative medication in his system at levels that suggested he had been drugged. This finding was crucial. It suggested that Christian had been deliberately incapacitated before the fire was set, ensuring he couldn't escape. As the investigation progressed, a horrifying picture emerged. Prosecutors developed a theory that Pharina Peterson and Terri Lynn Peterson had conspired together to kill Christian. They believed the two women had grown tired of caring for the special needs child and had decided to eliminate him in a way that could be made to look like an accidental death. The prosecution's theory was that Christian had been given sedatives to make him unconscious or too drowsy to escape. The mobile home had then been deliberately set on fire. Pharina and Terri Lynn had left the premises before the fire took hold, creating an alibi that they had been away when the accident occurred. The evidence supporting this theory included the arson investigation findings showing the fire was deliberately set, the toxicology results showing Christian had been sedated, the inconsistent statements from both women about their whereabouts, witness testimony about statements they had made expressing frustration with caring for Christian, financial records showing both women had limited resources and were struggling with the costs of raising a special needs child, and phone records showing communications between Pharina and Terri Lynn in the hours before the fire. Based on this evidence, both Pharina Peterson and Terri Lynn Peterson were arrested and charged with malice murder, felony murder, arson, and cruelty to children. The cases of Pharina Peterson and Terri Lynn Peterson were tried separately in Dougherty County Superior Court. Both trials received significant media attention in Southwest Georgia, with the Albany Herald and local television stations providing extensive coverage. Pharina Peterson's trial came first. As Christian's mother, she faced particularly harsh judgment from the community. Mothers are expected to protect their children, not to harm them, and the idea that Pharina had participated in killing her own son was almost incomprehensible to many people. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. Fire investigators explained how they determined the fire was arson. Toxicologists explained the sedatives found in Christian's system. Medical examiners described the cause and manner of death. Witnesses testified about Pharina's statements expressing frustration with Christian. Perhaps most damaging was evidence that Pharina had researched fires and insurance claims in the days before Christian's death. Computer forensics experts testified about searches found on computers accessed by Pharina, suggesting premeditation and planning. The defense argued that Pharina loved her son and would never have harmed him. They suggested that if the fire was indeed arson, it must have been set by someone else, perhaps Terri Lynn acting alone, or even an unknown third party. They attempted to create reasonable doubt by questioning the certainty of the forensic evidence. But the jury was convinced by the prosecution's case. They found Pharina Peterson guilty of malice murder and the related charges. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Terri Lynn Peterson's trial followed a similar pattern. As Christian's grandmother, she had a duty to protect him, but prosecutors alleged she had instead participated in planning and executing his murder. The evidence against Terri Lynn was similar to that presented against Pharina. The arson findings, the toxicology results, the inconsistent statements, and evidence of planning. The prosecution argued that the two women had worked together, each reinforcing the other's resolve to carry out this terrible act. Terri Lynn's defense also attempted to shift blame, suggesting that if anyone was responsible for Christian's death, it was Pharina, not Terri Lynn. They portrayed Terri Lynn as a grandmother who had tried to help her daughter, but who had not participated in harming Christian. The jury found Terri Lynn Peterson guilty as well. Like her daughter, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of 7-year-old Christian Lee. Both Pharina Peterson and Terri Lynn Peterson filed appeals of their convictions, challenging various aspects of the trials and arguing that the evidence was insufficient to support the verdicts. Their cases made their way through the Georgia Court of Appeals and to the Georgia Supreme Court. The appellate courts reviewed the trial records, the evidence, and the legal arguments. In both cases, the courts found that the trials had been conducted properly and that the evidence was sufficient to support the jury's verdicts. The convictions were affirmed, meaning that both women would serve their life sentences without the possibility of parole. These affirmations were important because they confirmed that the legal process had been followed correctly and that the evidence truly supported the conclusions reached by the juries. Unlike the Cortney Bell case discussed earlier, where the conviction was reversed on appeal, the convictions of Pharina and Terri Lynn Peterson have stood firm through all levels of review. Christian Lee's case raises important issues about children with special needs and the support systems available to families caring for them. Children with disabilities often require more intensive care, more medical attention, and more patience than typically developing children. This can create stress for families, particularly when financial resources are limited and social support is lacking. The tragic reality is that children with disabilities are at higher risk for abuse and neglect than their typically developing peers. Multiple studies have confirmed this disturbing trend. The reasons are complex. The increased stress of caregiving, the isolation that families may feel, the financial burdens, and sometimes the frustration when a child's needs seem overwhelming. This doesn't excuse what happened to Christian. Nothing could excuse drugging a 7-year-old and burning him alive. But it does point to the importance of providing robust support services for families caring for children with special needs. Access to respite care, financial assistance, counseling, and community support can make the difference between a family that struggles but perseveres and a situation that spirals into tragedy. In the aftermath of Christian's death, child advocacy organizations in Georgia used his case to push for better services and support for families with special needs children. They argued that preventing such tragedies requires investment in family support systems, not just prosecution after harm has occurred. The Peterson case is unique in this documentary because it involves 2 generations of family conspiring together to kill a child. The grandmother-mother conspiracy adds a dimension of horror to an already unthinkable crime. In many child abuse cases, extended family members are part of the solution. They recognize abuse, report it, or provide alternative care for endangered children. Grandparents often serve as protectors, stepping in when parents are struggling or abusive. But in this case, the grandmother was not a protector but a co-perpetrator. The relationship between Pharina and Terri Lynn appears to have been mutually reinforcing in the worst possible way. Rather than one woman tempering the other's frustrations or providing a voice of reason, they apparently fed each other's resentment and collaborated on a solution that was utterly evil. Child psychologists who have studied cases where multiple family members collaborate in abuse note that such situations often involve a shared distorted worldview. The perpetrators convince each other that their actions are justified or necessary. They reinforce each other's rationalizations. And they create a bubble of moral corruption where terrible acts can be planned and executed without one party objecting or seeking help. Christian Lee deserved a family that would love and care for him despite the challenges his special needs presented. Instead, he had a mother and grandmother who viewed him as a burden to be eliminated. His death represents one of the most profound betrayals imaginable, not just by one parent, but by two generations of family who should have protected him. Both Pharina Peterson and Terri Lynn Peterson remain incarcerated in Georgia, serving their life sentences without the possibility of parole. Their cases have been featured in legal education materials as examples of conspiracy to commit murder and of the particular horror of familial child homicide. Case 10. Lamora Williams. The Oven Murders, Fulton County, Georgia, 2017. On the night of October 13, 2017, Jamil Penn received a video call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The call was from Lamora Williams, the mother of his two young children. What he saw on that video call was beyond comprehension. On the screen were his two sons, 1-year-old Jacarter Penn and 2-year-old Keont Penn. But they weren't playing or sleeping. They appeared lifeless, with what looked like severe burns on their bodies. Jamil, horrified and disbelieving, immediately called 911 from his location and urged them to go to the Atlanta apartment where Lamora lived with the children. Atlanta police officers were dispatched to the Oakland City West End apartment complex on Cascade Avenue. When they entered the apartment, they found a scene that veteran officers would describe as one of the most horrific they had ever witnessed. The bodies of Jacarter and Keont were found in the apartment. Both children had suffered severe burns. As investigators processed the scene, they made a discovery that was almost impossible to believe. Evidence suggested that the children had been placed in the kitchen oven and burned to death. Lamora Williams was at the apartment when police arrived. She was immediately taken into custody and transported to Atlanta Police Headquarters for questioning. The investigation into the deaths of Jacarter and Keont Penn was led by the Atlanta Police Department's Homicide Unit, with assistance from the Fulton County District Attorney's Office and various forensic specialists. The crime scene was processed meticulously, with every detail documented and analyzed. The medical examiner's autopsy confirmed what the initial scene had suggested. Both children had died from thermal injuries consistent with being exposed to extreme heat in an enclosed space. The pattern and severity of the burns, combined with other forensic evidence from the apartment, indicated that they had been placed inside the kitchen oven. The question facing investigators was not just what had happened, but how and why. What could drive a mother to kill her own children in such a horrific manner? What was Lamora Williams's mental state? And what were the circumstances that led to this unthinkable act? As investigators delved into Lamora's background and the family situation, a complex picture emerged. Lamora Williams was a 24-year-old mother of 4 children at the time of the murders. She had a history of involvement with the Division of Family and Children's Services due to concerns about her ability to care for her children. There were reports of unstable housing, financial struggles, and questions about her mental health. Jamil Penn, the father of the 2 murdered children, had a troubled relationship with Lamora. They were not together at the time of the murders, and there was ongoing conflict about custody and visitation. Some witnesses reported that Lamora had expressed resentment about the burden of caring for the children, though this was disputed by others who knew her. On October 14, 2017, less than 24 hours after the bodies were discovered, Lamora Williams was formally arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, 4 counts of felony murder, 4 counts of aggravated assault, 4 counts of cruelty to children in the first degree, and 4 counts of concealing the death of another. The severity and number of charges reflected the heinous nature of the crime and the multiple legal theories under which Lamora could be held responsible. Each child's death generated multiple charges under different legal provisions. Lamora was held without bond at the Fulton County Jail. The case immediately attracted massive media attention, not just in Atlanta or Georgia, but nationally and even internationally. The method of murder was so shocking that news outlets around the world covered the story. Headlines described the case in stark, horrifying terms, capturing the unthinkable nature of the crime. The Atlanta community reacted with shock and grief. Vigils were held for Cortney and Candice. Strangers who had never met the children left flowers, teddy bears, and candles at the apartment complex. The case became a symbol of the worst possible failure of maternal protection. As the case moved through the legal system, a critical issue emerged. Was Lamora Williams mentally competent to stand trial? Under Georgia law, a defendant must be able to understand the nature of the charges against them and be able to assist in their own defense. If a defendant is found incompetent, they cannot be tried until they are restored to competency. Lamora's defense attorneys filed motions requesting that she be evaluated for competency. The court ordered psychiatric evaluations by forensic psychologists to assess her mental state and her ability to participate in her defense. These evaluations became a central issue in the case, leading to multiple hearings and delays. The evaluations needed to address several questions. Did Lamora understand the charges against her? Could she comprehend the legal proceedings? Did she have the cognitive ability to communicate with her attorneys and make decisions about her defense? And did she have any mental illness that affected her competency? The competency evaluation process in serious criminal cases can be lengthy and complex. Defendants are sometimes sent to state psychiatric facilities for extended observation and evaluation. In Lamora's case, the process involved multiple evaluations, with experts sometimes reaching different conclusions about her mental status. Some evaluations suggested that Lamora had significant mental health issues that might affect her competency. Others concluded that while she had mental health challenges, she was nonetheless competent to stand trial. The defense and prosecution presented dueling expert testimony about her psychological state. The competency hearings stretched over months and then years. Each time the court found her incompetent, she would be sent for treatment with the goal of restoring her to competency. Each time experts reported progress, new hearings would be held to reassess her status. This process, while frustrating to those seeking swift justice, is a fundamental protection in the American legal system. The right to a fair trial includes the right to understand the proceedings and participate in one's own defense. Trying someone who is genuinely incompetent violates due process and could result in wrongful convictions being overturned on appeal. Throughout the lengthy pretrial proceedings, Jamil Penn, the father of Cortney and Candice, has been a vocal presence. He has given numerous interviews to media outlets, expressing his grief, his anger, and his determination to see justice done for his sons. Jamil has described the video call that first alerted him to the tragedy as the worst moment of his life. He has spoken about his sons' personalities, Candice's smile, Cortney's curiosity, giving voice to two children who can no longer speak for themselves. He has also expressed frustration with the lengthy legal process. While he understands the legal necessity of competency evaluations, he has struggled with the delays in bringing Lamora to trial. For a father who lost his children in such a horrific way, every delay extends his pain and postpones any sense of closure or justice. Jamil has been present at most court hearings, sitting through hours of legal arguments and psychiatric testimony. His presence serves as a reminder that behind the legal technicalities and psychiatric evaluations are two real children who died terrible deaths and a father who grieves for them every day. Other family members have also spoken out. Lamora's surviving children were placed in protective custody and eventually with relatives. Those children lost their brothers and their mother, all in one terrible incident that they may struggle to understand for the rest of their lives. As of the time of this documentary's production in early 2026, Lamora Williams has not yet gone to trial. The case has been pending for over 8 years, with repeated competency evaluations, hearings, and delays. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office has maintained its commitment to prosecuting the case. They have publicly stated that they will seek the maximum penalties available under Georgia law, which could include life without parole or even the death penalty, given the age of the victims and the heinous nature of the crimes. The defense has continued to raise competency issues and to prepare for what will undoubtedly be a complex trial. They have indicated that if Lamora is ultimately found competent to stand trial, mental health will be a significant aspect of the defense strategy. Georgia law allows for verdicts of not guilty by reason of insanity if a defendant can prove they were unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crime due to mental illness. The lengthy pretrial process in this case is not unusual for serious criminal cases involving mental health questions, but it is frustrating for everyone involved. The courts must balance the defendant's rights against the interests of justice and the victims' families. Each hearing, each evaluation, each legal motion adds time to a process that seems interminable to those waiting for resolution. Legal experts who have followed the case note that when it finally does go to trial, it will be one of the most significant and challenging cases in recent Georgia history. The shocking nature of the crime, the compelling evidence, the mental health questions, and the extensive pretrial record will all factor into what is likely to be a lengthy and complex trial. The question that haunts everyone who learns about this case is simply, how? How could a mother place her own children in an oven? What mental state, what circumstances, what combination of factors could lead to such an act? Mental health professionals who study maternal filicide, the killing of children by their mothers, have identified several categories of perpetrators. Some mothers kill their children during severe postpartum depression or psychosis, genuinely believing they are saving the children from some imagined threat. Some kill their children as revenge against a partner, using the children as weapons in adult conflicts. Some kill their children out of frustration, during moments of rage triggered by crying or misbehavior. And some kill their children due to severe mental illness that completely disconnects them from reality and moral reasoning. Without access to the confidential psychiatric evaluations in Lamora Williams's case, it's impossible to know definitively which category might apply. What we do know is that whatever drove Lamora to commit these acts, the result was the death of two innocent toddlers in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. The case has sparked discussions about maternal mental health, the support systems available to struggling mothers, and the intervention points where tragedy might be prevented. If Lamora was suffering from serious mental illness, could that illness have been identified and treated before it led to violence? If she was overwhelmed by the responsibilities of single parenthood, were there resources available that she didn't access or didn't know about? These are difficult questions with no easy answers. Millions of mothers experience mental health challenges, financial stress, and parenting difficulties without harming their children. The factors that push someone from struggling parent to child killer are complex and not fully understood. In all the legal proceedings, psychiatric evaluations, and media coverage, it's crucial to remember that at the center of this case are two little boys whose lives were cut short in the most terrible way. Keont Penn was 2 years old when he died. He was just beginning to form sentences, to develop his personality, to engage with the world around him. Family members remember him as a happy child who loved playing with toys and watching cartoons. He would never start school, never make friends, never experience the joys and challenges of growing up. Jacarter Penn was only 1 year old, just a baby. He was learning to walk, beginning to explore his environment with the curiosity natural to toddlers. He had his whole life ahead of him. That life was stolen before he even had a chance to remember his own early years. Both boys deserved to be safe, protected, and loved. They deserved mothers who would nurture them, care for them when they were sick, comfort them when they cried, and guide them as they grew. Instead, they died in pain and terror at the hands of the person who should have been their greatest protector. A small memorial exists in Oakland City, West End, where the boys died. Neighbors occasionally leave flowers or stuffed animals there, keeping the memory of Jacarter and Keont alive. Their father keeps their photos and speaks about them publicly, ensuring that they are remembered as children, not just as victims in a notorious case. The Lamora Williams case has had ripple effects beyond the immediate tragedy. It has become a case study in forensic psychiatry, in the competency evaluation process, and in how the justice system handles defendants with serious mental illness. As this documentary reaches its conclusion, the Lamora Williams case remains unresolved. She sits in Fulton County Jail awaiting trial, while the legal system works through the complex process of determining her competency and eventually bringing the case to trial. For Jamil Penn and the extended family of Jacarter and Keont, this means living in a state of suspended resolution. The boys are gone, but their mother has not been tried. Years have passed, but closure remains elusive. The pain is constant, but justice is still pending. When the case finally does go to trial, whether that's later in 2026 or in subsequent years, it will be one of the most watched trials in Georgia's recent history. The evidence will be presented. The psychiatric testimony will be heard. A jury will deliberate, and a verdict will be reached. Whatever that verdict is, it won't bring Jack Carter and Kuyant back. It won't erase the trauma their family has experienced. It won't fully answer the question of how a mother could do such a thing. But it will represent society's formal judgment on what happened in that Atlanta apartment on that terrible night in October 2017. The Lamora Williams case stands as perhaps the most shocking case in this documentary. The method of murder, placing children in an oven, is so beyond normal human comprehension that it has seared itself into public consciousness. It represents the absolute extreme of maternal violence, a perversion of the maternal role so complete that it challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature and mother-child bonds. Conclusion: understanding the unimaginable. We've now examined 10 cases from Georgia's criminal history. 10 cases where mothers or maternal figures killed or conspired to kill children who should have been under their protection. These cases span from 2001 to 2022, covering more than 2 decades of Georgia's darkest family tragedies. What can we learn from these cases? What patterns emerge? What systemic issues do they reveal? And how can society work to prevent such tragedies in the future? Several themes appear across multiple cases. First, many of these mothers were dealing with significant stressors: financial hardship, relationship conflicts, substance abuse issues, or mental health challenges. While millions of people face these same stressors without harming their children, these factors appear to create conditions where violence becomes more likely. Second, many of these cases involved some prior contact with child protective services or other intervention systems. Children who ultimately died had previously been the subject of DFCS reports, or their families had been known to social services. This points to the challenge of identifying which families need intervention and providing that intervention effectively with limited resources. Third, several cases involved prolonged abuse before the fatal incident. These weren't always sudden explosions of violence, but rather escalating patterns of abuse that culminated in death. This suggests that there were intervention points where tragedy might have been prevented if warning signs had been recognized and acted upon. Fourth, many cases involved attempts to conceal the crime or make it appear accidental. Mothers staged kidnappings, started fires, or created cover stories. This consciousness of guilt and attempt at deception distinguishes these cases from situations where a parent might accidentally harm a child and immediately seek help. Mental health emerges as a significant factor in several cases. Some defendants underwent competency evaluations. Some had documented histories of mental illness. Some exhibited behavior that suggested possible psychiatric conditions. This raises complex questions about the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility. Georgia law, like most states, recognizes that severe mental illness can affect criminal culpability. But mental illness doesn't excuse all behavior, and the vast majority of people with mental health conditions never harm anyone. What's clear is that better access to mental health care, particularly for mothers and families in crisis, could potentially prevent some tragedies. Early intervention, effective treatment, and ongoing support for people with serious mental illness might reduce risk factors before they culminate in violence. Many of these cases revealed failures in child protective systems. Social workers were overwhelmed with cases. Warning signs were missed or not acted upon. Communication between agencies was inadequate. Resources were insufficient to provide the level of monitoring and support that high-risk families needed. In the aftermath of high-profile child deaths, Georgia has implemented various reforms to its child welfare system. These include lower caseloads for social workers, better training in risk assessment, improved information sharing between agencies, and enhanced protocols for investigating child abuse allegations. But systemic reform is challenging. It requires sustained political will, adequate funding, and cultural changes in how agencies operate. Progress has been made, but each new tragedy reminds us that the work is never complete. The question that haunts everyone who learns about these cases is simply, why? Why would a mother harm her own child? It violates our deepest assumptions about human nature, about maternal instinct, about the bonds between parent and child. The uncomfortable truth is that there's no single answer. Human behavior is complex, influenced by biology, psychology, social factors, individual circumstances, and sometimes random chance. Some mothers in these cases appeared to be genuinely mentally ill, disconnected from reality in ways that affected their moral reasoning. Others seemed to have capacity for violence that overrode whatever parental feelings they might have had. Still others made calculated decisions based on perceived self-interest, treating their children as obstacles to be eliminated. What we can say with certainty is that these mothers represent extreme outliers. The vast majority of mothers, even those facing similar stressors and challenges, never harm their children. They find ways to cope, to seek help, to manage their difficulties without turning to violence. These 10 cases, while horrifying, are not representative of motherhood. They represent its darkest perversion. Throughout this documentary, we've focused necessarily on the perpetrators, their crimes, and their prosecutions. But we must conclude by remembering the victims. Quinton Simon, who should be turning 4 years old this year. Imani Moss, who should be 23 years old now. Cameron Irvin Carter, who should be in his mid-20s. Philip and Carrie Height, who should still be part of their family. Jayla Davis, who never even reached her first birthday. Multiple children in the Sonya Smith household, whose lives will forever bear the scars. Shannon Dedrick, who should be 23 years old now. Darius Hawkins, whose death remains surrounded by legal ambiguity. Christian Lee, whose special needs made him particularly vulnerable. And Ja Carter and Kuyant Penn, babies whose deaths were so horrific that the case captured international attention. These children were real people with personalities, preferences, potential. They had favorite toys, foods they liked, people who loved them. Their lives mattered. Their deaths represent not just criminal cases, but profound human tragedies. If there's any positive message to take from these dark stories, it's this. We all have a role to play in protecting children. If you see signs of abuse, report them. If you know a parent who is struggling, offer help. If you work in a profession that involves contact with children, take your responsibility as a mandated reporter seriously. Support policies and funding for child protective services, mental health care, and family support programs. Recognize that investing in prevention is far better than dealing with tragedy after it occurs. And if you're a parent struggling with the challenges of raising children, know that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to admit when you're overwhelmed. There are resources available, from parenting hotlines to counseling services to respite care. Seeking help is a sign of strength and responsibility, not weakness. This has been True Crime Silent Files documentary investigation into the most evil mothers in Georgia criminal history. These cases are difficult to hear about, disturbing to contemplate, and challenging to understand. But they're important. They remind us of the vulnerability of children, the responsibility of parents, and the need for society to protect its youngest members. Thank you for staying with us through this difficult journey. Please take a moment to subscribe to True Crime Silent Files, hit the like button, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue producing thorough, well-researched documentaries on important criminal cases. Remember these victims. Honor their memory by working to ensure no other children suffer similar fates. And never forget that behind every crime statistic is a real person whose life mattered. This has been True Crime Silent Files. Thank you for watching.